Hi, Richard.
It's great to be with you.
What do you make of this shift in tone from President Trump, Richard?
So President Trump has long been quite dismissive of Ukraine's chances of winning this war. And his peace initiative has always been, as a starting point, that Ukraine would have to give up large amounts of territory. We never got that far into saying how much. What President Trump just said, however, was, well, maybe Ukraine wins this war. Maybe Ukraine takes back all of its territory. It's a change of tone. It's much more optimistic, but I think it's a message to the Russians at a time when things are escalating and when Russia and Vladimir Putin are escalating.
I wonder if Zelensky takes the president at his word, or if there is an understanding that this is possibly a threat to Russian President Vladimir Putin. And the question is, if it is a threat to the Russian president, does he even care?
Well, he has the potential to care a great deal because this is a threat. Now, whether President Trump makes good on this threat or not is a different question. And the reaction so far from Moscow, from the Kremlin, has been, this is just President Trump trying to govern a country through social media. He'll come back. He'll come back around. That was a specific quote. But the reason I think this is more about Europe and more about a general escalation than it is specifically about Ukraine, look what's just happened over the last couple of weeks across Europe. We saw those 20 drones fly into Poland, which is a NATO country. Poland and NATO went into high alert, scrambled the forces. They had to shoot some of these drones down. They convened an urgent message, and Putin kind of laughed it off, saying, oh, it was a mistake. But it wasn't an isolated incident. Just over the last few days, the airport in Copenhagen shut for 4 hours because of suspicious drone activity. There have been incursions that in Estonia, just in the last few days, where 3 Russian MiG jets entered Estonian airspace, Estonia also a NATO member, and stayed there for 12 minutes.
Wow.
Now, that's not an accident. You don't fly into someone's airspace and stay there for 12 minutes unless you're trying to send a message.
When I spoke with Ambassador McFaul on the day of the Alaska summit between President Trump and President Putin, Ambassador McFaul, who is a U.S. ambassador to Russia under the Obama administration, who has sat in rooms with Russian President Vladimir Putin, said that President Trump was essentially handing the keys over to Putin.
What I see is that Putin thinks that momentum is on his side. They are making incremental gains at tremendous loss of life of Russian soldiers, but he doesn't care about that. But the biggest thing why he thinks time is on his side is because we, the United States, are abandoning Ukraine right now.
Since this summit, have we seen a shift in alliances?
President Trump is swerving a bit in the road. One day he's bringing Vladimir Putin to Alaska, and President Zelensky said time and time again that it was a disaster that Trump gave Putin everything he wanted. There was supposed to be a trilateral summit coming up. The trilateral summit never happened. There were no ceasefire negotiations. Putin got something. The U.S., Ukraine got nothing. But now we're seeing potentially a tougher policy as Europe is being pushed, as Vladimir Putin is probing Europe, I don't want to say goading them, but sort of throwing down the gauntlet, saying, here's a challenge. What are you going to do about it? And military analysts that I've spoken to believe that part of the reason that Putin is doing this, sending the drones, sending the jets, taunting NATO, is trying to send a message to NATO countries, but also the populations of NATO countries to put pressure on their government not to support the Ukrainian government. Specifically, not to send sophisticated air defenses to Ukraine, not to send advanced weapon systems to Ukraine, not to ever deploy their own soldiers to Ukraine as some sort of peacekeeping force, because Vladimir Putin is sending a message, you might need them at home. Don't send them to Ukraine. You could be threatened. Don't do this. Don't escalate this because we can come to your house or come to your airport or what have you.
President Zelensky kind of weighed in on what he thought of the meeting he had with President Trump.
And I'm grateful for this meeting. And we expect America's actions to push Russia toward peace. Moscow fears America and always pays attention to it.
Is there a sense, Richard, that you think Ukrainians can trust the United States in this process?
I don't think the Ukrainians feel that way. They don't feel that way about this administration. And I think they've reached a point where they know they can't trust anyone with their own future. And then watching the U.S. sort of sometimes blow hot, sometimes blow cold, freeze intelligence, which the Trump administration did. No, I don't think they would trust the U.S. to be an honest middleman or that could ensure their future safety. But that doesn't mean they have a lot of choice in it. You know, you're gonna take the deal that you think is the best, and many Ukrainians, I think, would like to see an end to this conflict. They would like to see the fighting stop in a truce. It's been very long and hard on the Ukrainians, and they don't want to see this escalate, but they don't want to also have a peace deal that just falls apart and is humiliation and is capitulating to Vladimir Putin, and then they believe rewarding him, which will only amount to appeasement and him coming back for more later.
Richard Engel, thank you.
Good to talk to you.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.